First consideration is last year's budget. If you're going to present a proposal, say, hey, we operate in 3 countries and we want 5% for Malaysia, 4% for Singapore, 6% for Philippines, and for Indonesia, 6%. Okay, the decision makers always want to know what was last year's budget. If the economic situation is about the same as last year, and you ask for the same merit budget as last year, you already have a 50-50% chance of just getting approval right away. Everything's the same. So no different than last year's request. Okay. But if you ask for $1 more than last year, oh my God, you have to have a lot of data. So they always want to know what was last year's number. Anything equal or less, pretty easy to get approval. Anything more, you got to have more data. So that's important, last year's budget. I've tried leaving it off my request, but they always ask for it. So just put it in there. Second, what is the salary budget trend? What are other companies budgeting? I've mentioned Mercer, Aon, Towers Watson, Korn Ferry. They should all have, good data on what companies are budgeting. A word of caution, we talked about filling out the Mercer data collection kit for the annual compensation benchmark survey. It's usually within that survey that they ask you, what is your merit increase budget going to be for the coming year? Now, they're asking you in May, like right now, it's late May, and you may have a Mercer or Towers data collection kit to complete and send in by this Friday. And they're asking you already, what's your merit budget going to be for 2025? You don't know. So what are you going to put in? You're going to just probably put in this year's number because you don't know. It's too far ahead. So this is one of the concerns with waiting for October when the big firms have their big year-end meetings and stuff. I mean, they do a good job and they have a big sample size. So, but just bear in mind, the first numbers that they come out with probably look very similar to the numbers that they just, spent. Your current market pay position is important. We talked about that a minute ago. If you have a market gap, you need to know it. Is it 10%? Is it 2%? What if you're over the market? What if your salaries are 5% above market salaries? And the trend is 4% for Singapore, let's say. What I would do, you could say, well, all we need is 3.7 because we're already 5% over the market, but we want to give people increment this year, but it doesn't have to be 4%. We could do 3.7. You could do something like that. What I would probably do is ask for 4%, which is what most companies are budgeting, even though we're paying 105 already. But I would then allocate to the managers in their worksheets something like 3.8, and I take that extra 0.2, and out of that 3.8, I might carve out some equity budget, but out of that remaining 0.2, I would use that for adding dependents to the healthcare, to adding dental, to adding mental illness, to all those long list of things that we want to do in our total reward package for our employees, but we never seem to have the money. We can't really ask for the money. Here's a tip. The easiest way to find money for your comp and ben initiatives is the salary increase budget because it's a huge number. And so do your benchmarking. Find out if you are at or even a bit above market on your salaries, especially if your turnover is okay. Don't do this if your turnover is bad. But if your turnover is in the 10 to 12%, you're not losing people as much as typical, and you're at or slightly above market on salaries, that's when you say other companies are budgeting for, give me 3.7 for merit, 0.1 for equity, and the other 0.2, I'm going to upgrade this benefit or give people a work at home allowance. You have the whole list of stuff, but you never knew where to find the money. So that's just a tip there. Okay, but for the catch-up budget, you need to know where are you? And remember, it's above the normal merit budget. Business and financial conditions. The company may be losing money. It may be having hard times, recession, or industry downturn. Well, you want to understand those, but you do your job. Let the CFO do their job. Not that we're insensitive to those realities, but say, here's our pay position, especially if you lag the market. And the market pay trend is X. Our industry pay trend is X. We want to budget X. And then let the other decision makers say, no, we can't afford it. But at least you did your job. You asked for it, so that when you can't give it and people leave, at least you did your job and you asked for it and they told you no. I generally think that that's a better way of operating your business, rather than just anticipating they're going to say no and say, well, I don't know, I guess if we have to freeze salaries this year, I would understand it. Our job is to attract and retain talent. Let's make the recommendation that enables us to attract and retain talent. If the rest of the business decides that there's other priorities for money, that's fine. They're free to do that. But our job is to make that recommendation that matches our pay philosophy. If we want to pay market, if we want to pay for performance, then let's ask for enough money to do those things. Okay, so business and financial conditions. I mentioned attrition rate versus our industry norm. This in combination with this, if your market pay position is low and your voluntary attrition rate is high versus the industry, then that's prime time, that's key prime conditions to ask for a catch-up budget, as we said. Right. Total cash, don't forget total cash, benchmark total cash, not just salaries. If you have really great allowances and incentives, then maybe, salaries don't have to match market, and so on. Promotion plans, yeah, as we've discussed. So as you're budgeting, don't forget promotions. Now, the last one, what about consumer inflation? And we'll just finish on this topic. I have one more slide on this. Consumer inflation gets a lot of attention in the media and even in our workforce when certain countries experience high consumer inflation. Most companies do not consider consumer inflation as a primary consideration on merit budgeting. Let me show you what I'm talking about. I run a survey every year called Asia Pay Pulse Survey. And I asked, what factors drive salary budgeting? The primary consideration is mainly, and this is true for the last 3 years because of the pandemic, main consideration, economic, business, and industry conditions. Before the pandemic, this was not number 1, it was number 2 or number 3. Salary budget surveys of what other companies are budgeting, that always used to be number 1. And maybe it will be again. But because of the pandemic, economic and business became number 1. But normally, we benchmark what are other companies budgeting. But as I've said, that's not enough. What if you have a market gap? You won't close the gap if you just follow the increased budget trend. You'll just maintain your gap. So the third one, market analysis. We have to determine our market position. Are we lagging? Are we ahead? Or are we, aligned? Consumer inflation and cost of living is green. And while some companies consider it a primary consideration, it's the number 1 secondary consideration. Meaning to say, it's not logically a consideration because the cost of labor is not actually driven by the cost of butter and eggs and fuel. The cost of labor is based on the supply and demand of labor. The cost of butter is based on the supply and demand of butter. When there were no chickens for Malaysia to send into Singapore, the cost of chickens went way up in Singapore. Okay, so supply and demand generally determines the price of anything, including talent. So logically, it doesn't quite stand as a business consideration for salaries. Let me give you two other points if you don't quite know how to stand behind that statement. We don't pay for cost of living because if we did, wouldn't everybody with a big family have a higher salary than the single people? But since that doesn't even enter the conversation at all, how can we say that your pay philosophy takes cost of living into account? If it did, big families would need bigger paychecks than single people. I'm just saying, okay, if it's logical to follow cost of living, then you can't ignore family size. Okay, so obviously we don't pay for cost of living. Second reason we don't pay for cost of living, if you still think it should be, people only raise the idea of the company keeping them whole with the cost of living when inflation is high. When inflation is low or zero, nobody talks about it. For the 5 years prior to the pandemic, 2014 to 2019, during that 5-year period, cumulative inflation in Singapore was roughly zero. Cumulative inflation in Singapore on the cost of living was zero. How many employees came knocking on HR door and saying, we should be kept whole with inflation? Nobody. Nobody wants to be paid zero when it's zero. It's only when inflation is higher than the salary trend that people will say anything about it, not the opposite. Okay, so I just wanted to equip you with some of the arguments. Okay, so the way I view consumer inflation, and it's important enough to have a green bar here, is that it's a popular sentiment. It's a popular sentiment among employees that their company should look after them. When I asked, oh, it's not there in the slide. I'll just stop sharing here, but I'll just share one more thing. The same survey that I run, Asia Pay Pulse survey, I asked, what actually is your company's strategy on addressing inflation? The number one response was, we don't provide inflationary pay increases. However, the merit increase includes a little extra money in those countries that have high inflation. So they do give a little bit of money, but they don't call it inflationary adjustment because that's a dangerous precedent. You do it once, people will remember for 40 years. So they call it, part of the merit, but they put a little something in there.